Grace stood there, her thin white shirt clinging to her body, revealing her curves. Despite her age, her body had a charm that I couldn't take my eyes off of. Her long, wet hair clung to her neck and cheeks, a few drops of water falling onto the wooden floor in long streaks. The faint yellow light from the kitchen lamp reflected through the water, drawing a faint but heart-wrenching outline. I turned away reflexively, but not fast enough to stop myself from seeing it. My heart was pounding, and finally it happened. Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm 23, a recent graduate freelance photographer. I say photographer, but most of my time is spent wandering around with my old camera, trying to find something beautiful enough to distract me from the chaos in my head. I came to Portland because I failed. Failed at my first job, failed at my first love. And I thought, maybe this quiet place would give me a chance to start over, or at least to breathe. The house next door had a porch covered in pale purple wisteria. I noticed it the first morning. Not because it was beautiful, but because it looked so quiet. The windows were always half closed, the sheer white curtains covered. The day I moved in, I met Grace for the first time. She stood on the porch, wearing a beige cardigan, holding a cup of hot tea. Our eyes met over the messy pile of cardboard boxes I was holding. Hi. Her voice was low-light as the wind, but listening closely, it sounded a bit hoarse. Hi, I'm Ethan. Just moved in. I replied, embarrassed, because one hand was holding the camera, the other holding the book box. I'm Grace. Nice to meet you. She nodded slightly, then turned away. From that day on, we only stopped at brief nods whenever we happened to meet in the yard or when taking out the trash. A mature woman with a quiet beauty, a young boy lost in the new city. Two parallel lines, thought they would never intersect. The days passed more slowly in Portland than I thought. In the morning, the sound of sparrows perched on the wooden fence woke me up. In the afternoon, the late sunlight passed through the only window in the living room, drawing a long streak on the old wooden floor. I spent most of my time in the backyard, or in my homemade darkroom, developing film editing photos of the suburbs, empty fields, abandoned signs, moss-covered roofs. Here the silence was not as scary as in the old city. It made me hear my heartbeat, and the sound of leaves falling by Grace's fence. Grace rarely went out. Sometimes I saw her silhouette behind the window, reading a book or watering her small flower pots. She was so introverted that I wondered if anyone in the neighborhood really knew her. That night, Portland turned windy. The sky was dark with a hint of moisture from the afternoon rain. I couldn't sleep, so I took my camera out to the backyard, an old habit when my mind was in turmoil. The sound of a door opening softly on the other side of the fence made me look up. Grace. She sat alone at the old wooden table, only a glass of red wine in front of her. The yellow porch light fell on her shoulders. Her dark hair had a few drops of dew. Her eyes, distant, as if searching through the darkness for something long lost. I stood still, the camera heavy in my hand. I didn't intend to take a picture, but my professional instinct made me raise the camera. In the viewfinder, everything suddenly became clearer, the curve of her shoulders, the hands holding her wine glass, the eyes heavy with memories. Click. The shutter clicked softly. I lowered the camera and realized she was looking at me. Grace's eyes stopped on me, not angry or surprised, but unpredictable. A moment of calm, a little tired, and somewhere hidden the usual wariness of someone who had experienced much loss. I lowered the phone reflexively, a burning sensation spreading up my neck. I had never felt so clumsy. Sorry. I didn't mean to. My voice was low, lost in the sound of the wind and the night insects. Grace blinked slowly, her lips pursed slightly, then let out a soft sigh. It's okay. She replied, her voice low and hoarse, like the sound of old wood rubbing against each other. This night, not many people are awake. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. The darkness between the two houses became thicker, but it was no longer an awkward silence. It was more like a silence that no one wanted to break. A moment later, Grace spoke first, her fingers gently turning the wine glass in her hand. Do you take photos at night? Yes. The night light is more real. It doesn't pretend to be cheerful, like the light of day. I blurted out, realizing that my words sounded strange, but true. She tilted her head, the corners of her lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile, but her eyes softened. "You're young, but the way you talk is older than your age." Grace whispered, her eyes looking far away into the darkness of the backyard. I didn't know how to respond. I stayed silent, sat down on the steps, listening to the wind blowing through the faded wooden fence between the two houses. That night, I didn't take any more photos. I just sat there quietly observing. The smell of wine wafted through the humid air, the smell of wisteria mixed with the scent of rotting wood. Grace's hair swayed gently in the wind, reflecting the dim yellow light. She was quiet, but that silence was louder than any music I had ever heard. In that brief moment, I realized she was more than just the neighbor behind the window. She was a story, an untold story, and perhaps from that moment on, I wanted to listen to it. The knocking was so intense I thought I was dreaming. 3, then 4, urgent like a heart beating in panic. I jumped up, my bare feet stepping on the cold wooden floor. It was still dark outside, rain pattering on the thin tin roof. When the door opened, the person standing before me was Grace. She was almost not herself. Her hair was wet, her face was pale, her breathing was rapid. The thin coat, hastily thrown over her shoulders, could not cover her trembling shoulders. "Ethan, my father, he fell down. I think it was a stroke. I can't drive." Her voice was hoarse, almost broken. I didn't need to ask more. I just reached for the car keys and put on my thin coat. "Let's go," I said briefly, my heart pounding, but my voice trying to stay calm. We rushed into the night rain. The wind whipped at my face, cold enough to bite my skin. The car door slammed shut in the darkness, followed by the low roar of the engine and the tires scraping water across the wet road. Grace's hand shook slightly in her lap. I glanced over, her eyes were wide but dull, reflecting the flickering streetlights. "He's still breathing, but not opening his eyes," she said, her voice hoarse. "I called an ambulance, but they said the nearest hospital would be quicker if we drove ourselves." "We'll make it," I said, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The sound of the wipers swept across the glass, the rhythm echoing the sound of my heart beating in my chest. The rain slowed everything down. Droplets of water splashed against the glass, the headlights reflecting off in a blur. The silence stretched so long that I could hear her heavy breathing. "I'm not ready to lose another person," she said softly, as if confessing to the darkness. The words stabbed me. I didn't need to ask. I knew who she was referring to. Her husband. That sudden death must have been a scar that had never healed. "Have you ever lost someone?" Grace turned, her eyes still wet with rain. I gripped the steering wheel, my voice dropping. "Losing myself. After leaving the old place, losing direction, losing faith." I smiled awkwardly, but not losing a loved one. Grace said nothing. She just looked straight ahead. In that silence, I felt like we had just shared a part of ourselves without saying much. The road grew longer, the rain grew thicker, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door. I glanced over again. Grace's face was tense, but her eyes shone with something else. Not quite hope, not quite despair. A quiet, but proud pain. I realized for the first time she was not the quiet neighbor I had seen through the fence. She was a real person with fear and resilience mixed together. The hospital door opened, with a cold white light pouring down. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of hurried footsteps hit my ears as I helped Grace inside. She didn't cry. She just clutched her sleeves, her shoulders shaking slightly, her eyes trying to stay calm, while her hands were still cold. The nurse pulled her father onto a stretcher and pushed him into the emergency room. The door closed behind them, leaving us in the empty hallway with rows of cold metal chairs. I heard her breathing heavily, not from exhaustion, but from holding something back. I sat next to her, not touching her. Just silence. Sometimes presence is more important than words. Grace gently lowered her head into her hands, her wet hair sliding down to cover half her face. The hospital speaker sounded in the distance, monotonous and emotionless. I thought I was used to loss. Her voice was so soft that I thought I had misheard, but I guess not. I looked over. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes red but dry, like someone who had cried for so long that her tears had dried up. I wanted to say something, but none of it sounded real enough. "You're not alone," I finally said. She didn't answer. She just took a deep breath, then let it out slow and heavy, like a boulder being placed on the ground. The wait was longer than I expected. We sat side by side, speechless, listening to the ticking of the clock and the sound of the nurse's shoes on the tile floor. Every few minutes I glanced at her. Each time she straightened a little, like she was building up a calm shell for herself. When the doctor came out, Grace jumped up so fast that the chair fell behind her. The news made her whole body sag. Her father was out of danger, needed to stay for a few days. Alive, but not yet awake. She stood still for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. No hugs, no tears, just nods, the way someone too tired to react. I took her home near dawn. The road was empty except for the sound of light rain pattering on the windshield and the pungent smell of damp earth. She didn't say anything the whole trip. Neither did I. But the silence wasn't as heavy as before. It became something strangely warm. On the porch, Grace stood holding the hem of her coat, her eyes still red, but less panicked. She looked at me for a long moment and for the first time didn't avoid me. "Tonight, you're different than I thought," she said softly, her voice tired but sincere. "Different in what way?" I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. "You make me feel like I'm not completely alone." I was silent. Then I nodded lightly, like an unspoken promise. The door closed behind her, leaving me standing alone in the rain-soaked yard. For the first time since I moved here, I realized that the way I looked at Grace was different. It was no longer the casual neighborly look. It was something deeper, harder to name, but it had definitely started tonight. The morning after the hospital night, the neighborhood seemed quieter. I woke up late, my head aching from lack of sleep, but my mind was still haunted by Grace's eyes as she stood in front of the house. Something had changed. 2 days later, as I was hanging pictures in the backyard, a soft call came from the fence. "Ethan? Free." I turned around. Grace was there, holding a steaming cup of coffee. It was the first time I saw her smile, not exactly a big one, but softer than the usual polite nod. "Want to come in? I just made some—" I nodded. My heart was beating faster than it should have. Grace's kitchen was warm in a way that confused me. Light poured in from a small window, illuminating the scratched wooden table where 2 white porcelain coffee cups sat. The smell of roasted coffee mingled with the smell of old wood, and a faint scent of wisteria wafted in from the porch. The shelves were filled with cookbooks, glass spice jars, and a few small photo frames. I recognized one of them, a younger Grace in a white wedding dress, standing next to a tall man smiling brightly. Both of them looked straight into the camera, as if believing that tomorrow would never be different. Grace met my eyes. She didn't avoid them. She put down her coffee cup, her voice soft but steady. "My husband died 5 years ago, suddenly. One morning I woke up. He was gone." I was silent. All the comforting words were hollow. Only the sound of a spoon stirring the cup echoed softly in the silence. "My father never forgave me for not having children." She continued, looking down at the table. "He said I was selfish. And sometimes I believe he was right." I put my hand on the table, not touching her, just close enough so that if she needed it, the distance wouldn't be too far. "I don't think that's selfish," I said softly, surprised at how calm my voice was. Grace looked up, her eyes in that moment no longer distant. In the following days, we met more often. Not by appointment, just by chance. I went to her house again, this time to fix the shaky bookshelf. As I was fiddling with the screwdriver, Grace handed me her old phone, looking rarely confused. "Do you know how to set up music? I wanted to listen to some jazz. But every time I turned it on, it started playing loud commercials." I laughed. The scene was paradoxical. She asked me, and I was scattering screws all over her floor. "Let me see. It must be a setup error." She stood beside me, looking down her long hair, brushing my shoulder every time she leaned in. The scent of her hair, a faint scent of lavender shampoo, made my heart beat faster, without me knowing why. As the old jazz playlist played, her eyes lit up slightly. "See, not bad, right?" I joked. Grace chuckled. It was the first time I heard her laugh for real. Not polite, but relaxed. It was light as the wind, but left a lingering echo in my chest. Another afternoon, Grace taught me how to make coffee properly. Good coffee must be ground by hand. The water must not be too hot, and you must wait patiently, she said. I was clumsy. The coffee powder spilled all over the table, and she laughed, her voice soft but warm. "You really are used to convenience." "I only drink instant coffee." I laughed. "Convenient, but weak," she replied, and her eyes sparkled with amusement. In that moment, I realized that her kitchen, with its laughter, the smell of coffee, and the soft light, was the warmest place I had stood in years. That afternoon, as we were cleaning the living room, Grace accidentally dropped a box. The lid popped open. Inside was a carefully folded white wedding dress, slightly yellowed by time. We both froze. The space became dead silent. Only the ticking of the clock could be heard. Grace bent down to pick it up, her hand shaking slightly. "I didn't think I'd ever open this box again," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if talking to herself. I stood still, not asking. In her eyes there was a flash of old pain, but also something like a silent farewell. In that moment, I knew clearly I wanted to stay, to witness her go through this, not turn my back on it. From that day on, everything between Grace and I changed, not suddenly but silently, like the underground water flowing under the seemingly calm soil. We never met, but each other's presence gradually became a part of our daily life. I began to pay more attention to the little things. The way Grace fixed her hair when the wind blew hard, the habit of twisting an old ring on her bare finger, the soft breathing when she stood on the porch for a long time watching the rain. All of those things, no young girl I had ever known had. One morning, I saw her watering the flowers in the yard. The early morning sunlight filtered through the porch roof, casting a faint halo on her shoulders. I reflexively raised my camera, not pressing a button, just looking through the viewfinder. The old lens softened everything, the curve of her shoulders, the crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, the vague smile when she bent down to smell the wisteria. I never thought experience could be so beautiful. That afternoon, Grace invited me into her house to help clean out some boxes of old books. While she was busy dusting, I sat on the floor stacking each book into a box. The smell of old paper and rotten wood hung in the air. Occasionally we talked, short, unfinished sentences. "How old are you?" she asked, not looking up from her pile of books. 23, I replied, still flipping through the old photo album. She let out a soft hum, not sure if it was a laugh or a sigh. "I'm 39, almost twice your age." I looked up. Grace looked at me, the corners of her lips slightly raised, but her eyes were not joking. "Is there a problem?" I asked, half seriously, half testing. "No," she replied, then turned away, but her shoulders faltered for a moment. At that moment, I realized age is more than just a number. It was the memories, the scars, the sleepless nights, and the things people had lost. The things that made her different from everyone I had ever known. Another time, it was drizzling. Grace called me over because the coffee maker was malfunctioning. I walked into the kitchen and saw her standing by the sink, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied up. Her white shirt was slightly wet from the rain sticking lightly to her back. I turned away faster than I should have, my heart racing at the sight of such a mundane yet strangely intimate image. She handed me a towel, not looking. "Would you like to try some? I just learned a new way to roast beans." "Yes, I will." I took the towel, wiped my hair, avoiding looking at it for too long, but still thinking about the image. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. The sound of raindrops tapping on the porch mixed with the bubbling of the water. A sense of peace crept over me, so much peace that I was afraid because it was so easy to forget the world outside. One day, while cleaning the attic, we found the wedding dress box that we had accidentally opened the last time. Grace silently looked at the dress, her hand gently stroking the old fabric as if touching a memory. I stood next to her, not knowing whether to look away or stay still. That day, I thought I would wear it for the rest of my life. She whispered, her voice slow and cloudy like mist. I didn't answer. I just felt my chest tighten, both because of pity and because of another feeling that was hard to name. Part of me wanted to comfort her. Another part just wanted to keep quiet so that the sadness could be intact. From those trivial moments, one thing clearly formed in me. Grace was no longer the quiet neighbor behind the fence. She was the center of every frame I wanted to keep, and for the first time in months, I found myself wanting to stay. Not just stay in Portland, but stay with a specific person. I began to notice that I was staring at Grace longer than I should have. During the afternoons, sitting in the backyard, when she bent down to pick up fallen flowers or twirled her coffee cup in her hand, I would unconsciously observe every little detail, the outline of her wrists exposed under her sweater, the few thin silver hairs stuck to her black hair, and the faint smile that flashed when she heard a familiar melody. There was something about that maturity that made me both admire and crave it. Unlike the young girls I used to know, their feelings were loud quick to flare up and just as quickly to fade away. With Grace, everything was deeper and quieter. Like an old song, the more you listen to it, the more it resonates. One evening, I went over to return the book she had lent me. It was drizzling. Grace's kitchen was warm and yellow. She washed her hands and spoke over the sound of running water. "When I was your age, I think my life would have been very different." I leaned against the doorframe, silent. The words were soft, but behind them were a series of unspoken words. "How is it different?" I asked, my voice low. "I thought I would have 2 children, a big house, and never feel as lonely as I do now." She smiled softly, but her eyes did not smile. At that moment, I wanted to step closer, put my hand on her shoulder, and tell her that she would no longer be lonely. But I did not. I just stood still, holding the book so tightly in my hand that its spine bent slightly. The next day, while helping Grace clean up some old photo frames, I dropped the glass frame. The sound of breaking made us both stop. I bent down to pick it up and saw the photo inside was Grace and her ex-husband on their wedding day, both smiling brightly, their eyes so happy that it hurt me strangely. Grace bent down at the same time, our hands touching. We were both startled. The moment was brief, but lasted forever. When I looked up, our eyes met so close that I could hear her breathing. No one said anything, but in that look I realized I was no longer the peeping neighbor. I had truly entered her world. That night, when I got home, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the 16-year age gap, about the whispers I had heard from the neighbors about my parents. If they knew, how would they look at Grace? I was scared, but in the midst of that fear, there was something stronger. I didn't want to turn my back. Just like that, Grace's image crept into every photo I took after that, even though she wasn't in the frame. The color of the wisteria, flowers, the yellow light from the porch, the silhouette leaning in the rain, all of them had her image. I began to understand. There are things. Even though we know it will be difficult, we still choose to go forward. Since the day we found the wedding dress, Grace and I have seen each other more often, but neither of us has said it. We call it helping out, renovating the house together, or simply drinking tea. But I know that every time I go to her house, my heart beats faster than usual. On a weekend afternoon, we sit in the yard, each with a cup of tea. Grace plays the old jazz playlist she installed the day before, and I bring out a small speaker to play some indie songs I like. The warm saxophone blends with the rustic guitar, creating a strange sound, not belonging to anyone, but making the small yard unusually close. "Have you ever listened to jazz?" Grace asked, her eyes not leaving her teacup. "I have, but it feels so sad." I laughed. "Indie music is lighter, and I find indie, like things that are not ripe, a bit clumsy." She curled her lips slightly, a rare hint of teasing. "Like you," I blurted out, then bit my lip. She looked at me, just for a second, but the look was enough to make me blush. The next day, I went to help Grace fix the rotten wooden fence between our houses. We were standing closer than usual, holding the same board as we hammered in a nail. As the hammer struck our fingertips, accidentally brushed. Just for a moment, but my heart skipped a beat. I jerked my hand back so fast that the nail shifted out of place. Grace said nothing, just smiled, bending down to hold the board. Her eyes sparkled for a moment. I didn't know if it was embarrassment or recognition of what I was trying to hide. Another afternoon, while cleaning books from a high shelf, we bent down to pick up a fallen one. My forehead almost touched her cheek. The familiar scent of lavender surrounded me. I looked up, meeting those deep eyes, at such close range. I quickly turned away, pretending to look for more books. But my neck was burning. I knew she felt it too. Her lips pursed slightly, as if to stop herself from saying the words. One rainy day, I stopped by while she was trying on some old clothes to clean out her closet. The bedroom door was ajar. I walked past and stopped short. Grace was trying on an old dress. Not a wedding dress, but a cream-colored summer dress. The fabric was just the right fit, showing off her imperfect but vibrant curves. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the hem of the dress, her eyes uncertain. Not in a show-off way, but wondering if she was still beautiful enough. I turned away immediately, my heart pounding, both apologetic and unable to forget that image. That whole evening that image kept playing in my head, not because of the dress, but because of the way she looked at herself in the mirror. A beauty, mature but reserved. I began to hear whispers. Neighbors, people I only nodded politely to, stared at me longer than necessary as I passed. An old woman selling flowers on the corner whispered something to a friend, glancing toward Grace's house. One morning, as I bought coffee at the coffee shop at the end of the street, I could hear two women whispering behind me. "That young man lives next door to Grace all the time. He's over 16, not much older. People will talk." I stood still, my hand gripping my coffee cup so hard that the plastic lid was slightly deformed. In my head, loud indie music was playing. For the first time, music was no longer soothing. That afternoon, I saw Grace standing silently on the porch, her hand holding onto the wooden railing. Her face was calm, but her eyes were looking far away, too far for me to know what she was thinking. I didn't need to ask, I knew she had heard the rumors. "Are you okay?" I asked, quietly standing a few steps away. Grace didn't turn around, just replied, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear. "I'm not sure." The wind blew, carrying the faint scent of wisteria. In that moment, I understood. Not only me, but she too was torn between what was right and what was true. The gossip spread faster than I expected. It wasn't loud, just a few whispers. As I passed a few glances that lingered longer than usual, a half-smiling, half-sarcastic, raised eyebrow from the grocery man. But the worst part wasn't what they said to me, it was that Grace heard it. I found out one afternoon when I went to return the book she'd lent me. Grace was standing in the kitchen, still washing dishes, but her movements were so stiff that water was splashing. I called her name. She turned around, her eyes slightly swollen, as if she'd been crying. "I heard them," she said hoarsely. "They said I was selfish, said you were old enough to be my son." I was quiet for a few seconds. My head was filled with a cacophony of noise, the gossip, the indie music, the patter of rain on the porch. I wanted to tell her not to care, but when I looked into her eyes, I knew it would be meaningless. "What do you think?" I asked softly. Grace put down the plate, took a deep breath as if gathering all her courage to answer. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel I'm wrong. Sometimes—" She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "I don't want to care anymore." At that moment, we stood so close that we could hear each other's breathing. I didn't move closer, nor did I leave. We just stood there silent, in a fragile distance that we were afraid to break. In the following days, that distance became harder to maintain. Every time we touched hands when passing a cup of tea, every time we bent down to pick up books together, every time our eyes accidentally met for longer than necessary, all became small pieces slowly filling up the feelings we tried to deny. One rainy evening, the electricity in her house was flickering. I went over to help check the circuit breaker. The flickering light darkened the kitchen, leaving only the candle Grace had placed on the table. She bent down to retrieve the matchbox, the hem of her thin shirt sliding with the movement. I turned away reflexively, my ears burning. When she straightened up, meeting my flushed face, her lips curved slightly, not a smile, but not as cold as before. Just one look. But I felt that all the words we had tried to avoid were exposed in that silence. The next day, the rumors flared up clearly. I heard fragments of a conversation from the fence next door. "That boy stays at Grace's all day. She looks like she's rediscovering her youth." Grace heard it. I saw her shoulders stiffen as she crossed the porch. That night, she didn't turn on the outdoor light as usual. The windows were closed. The only light came from the kitchen, dim and distant. I stood by the fence, looking into the light. I wanted to knock. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but my feet stopped. I understood she needed time, and I was also asking myself, what am I doing? Despite trying to avoid it, the closeness still found me. One sunny morning, we were mending the fence together. As we bent down to hold the wood, our hands touched again. This time, neither of us pulled away. Just a brief touch, but I could see clearly we had long since ceased to be neighbors. Grace pulled her hand back and turned away quickly, but I caught a glimpse of her blushing cheeks. For the first time, she was the one who was confused in front of me. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the sound of rain on the roof. In the darkness, Grace's image, her eyes, Her smile, her silence, kept repeating itself. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I had no way back. I was afraid of rumors, afraid of society's gaze, afraid of myself. But the only thing I was sure of was that I didn't want to lose her. The news of Grace's death came one gray morning. I was standing in the yard drying photos when the doorbell rang. Short, sharp, not at all like the times Grace had called me over for tea. She stood in the doorway. Her coat was thin, her hair was tangled, her eyes were empty. There were no more tears, only a weariness so great that her whole body seemed to struggle for breath. "He's gone." The words came out unshaken, unbroken, scarily empty. I didn't ask anything. I didn't say a word of condolence. I just stepped out and put my arms around her. At first, her body was stiff. Then slowly, Grace leaned against me so lightly that I thought I was holding a shadow. The funeral took place 3 days later in the small church down the street. I stood at the end of the pew, not a relative, not an old friend, just an outsider who wanted to be closer to her than anyone else. Grace wore a long black dress, her hair tied up her face so calm that people thought she was not in pain. But I knew that every movement of her hands, every deep breath she took, was to keep herself from collapsing. In the moment the coffin was lowered, I saw her shoulders shake slightly. Not because of her crying, but because of the silence that was breaking in her chest. I wanted to go over, but I was afraid of people's eyes. Only when the service was over, when the church was gradually empty, did I dare to approach. Grace sat in the last row, her hands clasped together, her eyes looking down at the wooden floor. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She looked up. A smile flickered at the corner of her lips, thin and weak to the point of heartache. "No, but no one expects me to be okay right now." I didn't answer. I just sat down next to her silently, with her. Sometimes silence is the only thing that feels real enough. A few days later, Grace knocked on my door, not in a hurry this time, not in a panic. She stood there holding a small duffel bag, her voice low but firm. "I need to get out of Portland for a few days. Will you come with me?" There was no reason to refuse, no need to ask where. I nodded, and so we got in the car, carrying a few clothes, my old camera, and the pain I had yet to name. The drive to the beach was long and empty. The scenery on both sides changed slowly, from the damp wooden houses of Portland to the endless green-gray fields. The sky was still gray, but the salty sea breeze made me feel strangely relieved. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her eyes looking far away. Her hair blew lightly in the wind, a few strands caught her lips. For the first time I saw her relax. Not completely happy, but at least not wearing the usual cold facade. "I promised my husband I would take him to this place," she said softly as the sea appeared on the horizon. "But we never left. He died too soon." I didn't know what to say except the honest. "So now, you don't have to go alone." Grace turned. For the first time in weeks, her eyes didn't avoid me. It was like a wave, both gentle and strong, that swept me in before I could prepare. It was dusk when we reached the beach. The spring sea was cold and gray, the waves were steady, but not violent. We rented a small cabin on the sand, simple, just 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a wooden deck facing the ocean. The first night we sat on the deck, wrapped in a thin blanket. I picked up my guitar clumsily, playing a few chords. Grace looked at me, her eyes shining with a rare light. "Do you know any classics?" "I know a few chords to fly me to the moon." She smiled, then sang. Grace's voice was low, imperfect, but rich with emotion, carrying all the long nights she had lived through. I played slowly, she sang slowly, and the sound of the waves blended with the music into something hard to describe. In that moment, I realized I was not just attracted to her. I wanted to protect her. I wanted to stay. I wanted to be the reason she didn't feel alone. The days at the beach passed slowly, but not heavily. Every morning I woke up earlier, then Grace took my camera to the sandbank to capture the sunrise. The cold waves bit my ankles, the salty wind stung my face. But every time I turned around and saw the small cabin where she was still sleeping, I felt at peace. At noon, we walked along the beach, hardly speaking. Occasionally, Grace picked up a beautiful seashell and placed it in my hand, without saying anything. I kept them in my pocket like small pieces of memories that needed no words. One night, it was raining lightly. We sat in the cabin, the dim yellow light reflecting on the wooden ceiling. Grace poured wine into 2 glasses, her hands trembling slightly, but not from the cold. "I used to think I would grow old with someone," she said softly, her eyes on the wine glasses. "But it turns out, we never know what tomorrow will bring." I was silent, listening to the sound of rain tapping on the roof. "Have you ever been afraid of loving someone?" She turned her eyes, straight and soft at the same time. "All the time," I answered truthfully. "But maybe fear is not as good as missing out." Grace looked at me for a long time, not smiling, not crying either, just looking, as if considering something very important. Then she nodded slightly, turning back to look at the rain outside the window. On our last day at the beach, we sat on the deserted sand. The sky was dark. I brought my guitar, playing awkward chords. Grace sang an old jazz song. Her voice was hoarse, mixed with the wind. A song about longings that had never been put into words. When the song stopped, silence fell. I heard the sound of the waves, my heart and Grace's very soft sigh. "You're still very young," she said. "There are things you won't understand." "I don't need to understand everything," I replied, my eyes not leaving the dark, purple horizon. "I just need to know. I want to be here. With you." Grace turned. The gaze, for a moment, was unguarded. It softened, like the calm of the sea after a storm. There was no kiss, no formal confession. But in that silence, we both knew something had changed forever. As we drove away from the beach the next day, I looked in the rearview mirror. The sand had faded, the waves had grown smaller, but the distance between me and Grace had never been closer. Back from the sea, Portland greeted us with a heavy, early summer rain. The sky seemed to pour down everything it had kept for days, cold, heavy, and persistent. The street lights were shimmering with yellow reflections, dappling the windshield into thousands of fragments. By the time the car turned into the small alley leading home, the rain had soaked us to the bone. I turned off the engine, and we both sat still for a few seconds. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof of the car was like 1,000 heartbeats beating at the same time. Grace didn't say anything. Neither did I. We could only hear each other's breathing, mixed with the rain. Finally, she opened the door. "Hurry up!" Her voice was soft, but it was louder than the rain. We rushed out of the car. It took only a few steps from the car to the porch, but we were soaked as if we had just stepped out of the sea. When the door slammed behind us, the whole room fell silent. Only the sound of rain hitting the tin roof and our heavy breathing. Grace stood there, her thin white shirt clinging to her body. Her long wet hair clung to her neck and cheeks, and a few drops of water fell to the wooden floor in long streaks. The faint yellow light from the kitchen lamp reflected off the water, drawing a faint but heart-wrenching outline. I turned away, reflexively, but not fast enough to stop myself from seeing it. My heart was pounding, whether from the cold or from the sight before me. Grace looked at me, a look that was no longer defensive, no longer hidden. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her voice low, but not harsh. I swallowed, not knowing how to answer. And in that silence, I understood. She had seen it all. The small kitchen felt cramped. We were only a few feet apart, but that distance was heavier than the world outside. The sound of rain, of breathing, of heartbeats, all blended into one. Grace began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this." I took a step forward. "This?" She took a deep breath, still looking down. "You're young. I'm almost 40. My body isn't what it used to be. I'm afraid you'll be disappointed." I was quiet for a few seconds, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to make sure I meant what I said. "Grace?" I said her name for the first time. She looked up, surprised by how strangely low my voice was. "You're beautiful in a way no one else is. That's what makes me want to stay." Her eyes wavered, then softened, as if the words were something she didn't know she needed to hear. The next moment, neither of us made the first move. We moved closer at the same time. The remaining distance narrowed until our breaths mingled. The kiss came, not rushed, not fiery, slowly, timid but real, like two people finding refuge after so much loss. My hand trembled as it touched her cheek, warm and wet at the same time. She tilted her head slightly, letting the kiss last longer than a breath. All the sounds of the rain outside faded away. There was only the sound of our hearts, mine hers, beating in unison. The kiss lasted longer than I expected, not fierce, not rushed. Just a letting go of the defenses, the distances, the whispers out there that we used to fear. When our lips parted, we were still close enough to hear each other's breathing. Grace lowered her eyes slightly, her hand trembling slightly on the hem of her dress, as if struggling with something. I touched her hand, not pulling, just placing it lightly, and waited. She looked up. There was no longer the confusion in her gaze, only a naked honesty. "Are you sure?" Her voice was as thin as a thread, but as heavy as her heart. "All I'm sure of is here, with you," I whispered for the first time, dropping Grace and using you, not out of distance, but out of respect that seeped into my bones. A moment of silence. Then it was Grace who stepped forward. At that moment I understood. This was not weakness. This is her choice. The rain outside was still pouring down, but inside the small kitchen, the world shrank to just the two of us. The dim yellow light fell on her damp skin, reflecting the drops of water sliding down Grace's shoulders. My hand dared to hold hers for the first time, not squeezing, just intertwining, feeling each slight tremor. "I never thought," Grace said softly, her words breaking with her breath. "Imagine this," I asked, my voice hoarse, "that someone would see me, beautiful this way." That made me silent. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because there was no other words needed. I just placed my forehead on hers, the shortest distance where we could both hear each other's heartbeats. While the world outside was still noisy with rain, we chose silence. In that silence, all boundaries disappeared. Age, prejudice, gossip. There was only the honest feeling of two people who had lost so much, now finding something worth keeping. We stayed together all night. No noise, no rush, just light touches, close breathing, and a tenderness that neither of us knew we needed. When the rain stopped and dawn approached, I saw Grace sleeping peacefully in my arms, her face so relaxed that my heart ached. For the first time I thought, even if the whole world out there objected, you would still choose to stay. Gossip was no longer a whisper behind the fence. It had become a direct public gaze. Every time I went out to buy coffee or take a picture, I saw it, the lingering glances, the raised eyebrows, the half-smiles that everyone pretended to be indifferent. One morning, as I was fixing my lens on the porch, the old flower seller near my house stopped. He looked at me, shook his head, and said, "Young man, shouldn't you find someone your own age? Don't get lost." The words were gentle, but suggestive. I didn't reply, just smiled awkwardly. But inside, something was aching, not because of what he said, but because I knew Grace would hear these things 10 times more than I would. That afternoon, I went to Grace's house. She was sitting in the living room holding a cup of cold tea. Her face was tired, not physically tired, but tired from fighting the world out there. "I've heard it all," she said softly, not looking at me. "They said I was selfish. They said I used you." I stepped closer. "Do you believe that?" Grace was silent. There was a pause so long I could hear the clock ticking. Then she looked up, her eyes dark and deep but unsteady. "I don't know. You're old enough to be Rachel's brother, and I'm almost 40. I'm tired of explaining, tired of everyone thinking they know what's right for me." "And you?" I asked, my voice lower. "What do you think is right for you?" Grace didn't answer. She just gripped her teacup tighter until her knuckles turned white. A few days later, Rachel, Grace's best friend, showed up. I overheard them arguing from the backyard, through the half-open window. "He's old enough to be my brother, Grace." "What the hell are you doing?" Rachel's voice was harsh, worried, but also judgmental. "I don't know, Rachel." Grace's voice was choked. "I just know. I feel alive with him." "But what about your honor? What about what they say? How long do you want to live like this?" Silence. Grace sighed thin and long, like a thread about to snap. I didn't hear the rest, but I knew enough. Rachel was the voice of society, a voice Grace had heard so much that she had begun to believe it. That night, Grace didn't turn on the porch light as usual. I stood outside the fence looking into the darkness where the window was closed. A feeling of helplessness filled me. All I wanted to do was tell her, we weren't wrong. But how could I say it loud enough over all the noise? I knocked. For the first time, Grace didn't open it right away. When it opened, her eyes were tired, but not cold. "How long are you going to avoid me?" I asked, my voice low but clear. Grace bowed her head. "I'm not avoiding you. I just need to think." "Think about what?" "That. Are we worth it?" The words stabbed me in the chest, not out of doubt, but because they were so true. I stepped closer, holding her hand, which was shaking slightly. "If what we have is real, why should we let others define it?" I looked straight into her eyes. "I'm not afraid of them. I'm just afraid you'll leave." Grace looked up. Her eyes were moist, but this time not out of fear, but out of seeing. I made no promises, no vows, just squeezed her hand tighter, a silent but decisive choice. The next day, when I walked out into the street, the talk was still there. The eyes were still there. But for the first time, I didn't look away. I no longer feel ashamed, because I know amidst the noise of this world, we have found what we need to keep. The summer passed more slowly than I expected. Not because the gossip had disappeared. It was still there, whispered on street corners, in the longer-than-usual glances we gave each other as we passed. But one thing had changed, Grace, and I no longer let it dictate our lives. We still saw each other, but more quietly. No more long sittings at the coffee shop at the end of the street, or loud laughter in the yard. Instead, there were simple moments, afternoon tea in the kitchen, evenings listening to old jazz together, mornings waking up early to walk along the river while the city was still asleep. I grew up in ways I didn't expect. I was no longer the young boy who took pictures to escape my emotions. Now I took pictures to capture what mattered. A hand resting on a cup of tea, a distant gaze at the window, or a fleeting smile after a long day. As for Grace, she no longer kept her distance like before. The fear of age of the body, of what people think, still there, but lighter. She allowed herself to be happy, even if only for brief moments. Once, while we were listening to a song in the kitchen, she whispered, "I guess I'll never win over public opinion, but I don't need to anymore, do." I nodded, and in that silence, we knew we had made our choice. Late one afternoon, I helped Grace mend the old fence between our houses. The fence that had seen it all, the polite nods, the whispers, the longer than necessary glances. The rain had stopped, and the sky was surprisingly clear after so many gray days. As I hammered in the last nail, Grace stood beside me, wiping the paint off her fingers. Neither of us said anything. We just leaned against the newly painted fence, our eyes on the sunset that was falling down the street. I turned. She looked at me at the same time. No promises. No need to say forever. Just one look, enough to understand that we have chosen each other. On the other side of the fence, the children's laughter rang out. In the distance, rumors were still somewhere, but could not touch this small, peaceful space. We were silent, listening to the gentle wind blowing through the wisteria flowers. Peace, fragile but real. Our story, perhaps, has not ended yet, but there is no need to rush to know the next part. The important thing is right now, both Grace and I know, we are right where we belong. Ethan and Grace's story ends in a moment of peace, not because they won over public opinion, but because they chose to trust their true feelings. In a world where prejudice can be louder than the heart, sometimes the bravest thing is not to shout for the whole world to hear, but just to be quiet enough to hold the hand of the person you love and move on together. Thank you for listening to this story on Daily Unexpected Stories. If you find something that resonates with you, or simply want to hear more unexpected but heart-touching stories, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. See you in the next story.